You may be seated. As you're seated, what is it in a person's life, and what do they look like when they have committed themselves to be God's servants? And that's why the most written about man in the Bible is written about, because we can now, that we've got the big intro from God, God picked him out of the crowd and said, I'm looking at his heart. And when you look at the heart, which no one can see but God, you ask yourself, what was it he saw? What kind of man? What kind of a boy? What kind of a person? Does God see such great things about? What do they look like? How can I be that way? See, that's the kind of questions I ask. I mean, I'm always kind of muttering, out loud and talking and thinking and writing stuff down, because I'm always asking, okay, Lord, why is that in the Bible? What is it you want me to see? And so what does this person look like that's committed to being God's servant? God wants to explain that to us. So let's take it apart. First of all, the first 10 verses. The first thing we'll see that is the characteristic of one of God's servants is that if you're God's servant, number one, God's servants, like David was on God's mind. Listen to this. God uses the unchangeable features of his servants for his glory. What couldn't David pick? He didn't pick what number he was in the rank of sons. He was last. He didn't pick that. In fact, he didn't even pick that family. He didn't pick that dad. He didn't pick those brothers and sisters. He didn't pick that town to live in. Because he lived in that town, he didn't pick his profession. He had to be a shepherd. And in fact, no one else wanted to do it. And they made him do it. He didn't pick that. He didn't pick his ruddy appearance. He didn't pick his good looks or bad looks or height. You see, he was on God's mind. God designed him just for what he wanted him to do. What's amazing is I really believe David was little. Little. Why? Because he's an exact contrast to Saul, who was big. King Saul was head and shoulders. Now, I'm not talking about the shampoo. He was height, shoulder high. This much of him was higher than everybody else. Everybody's head came up to his shoulder in the whole nation. That's what it says in the Bible. He was head and shoulders above everyone else in Israel. This guy was a man's man. He would have been the perfect choice. Except his heart was a dwarf heart. And David was not big. In fact, he was a very young person. Some of the commentators believe that when he was anointed, he could have been 10 or 12 years old. When he does Goliath in, he could have been a very young teenager, 13, 14. We don't know. But he was young. He was little. He was on God's mind. And God uses the unchangeable features of servants for his glory. David's family life shows God's grace. He was not the oldest. He was not the strongest. He was not the most likely to succeed. He was overlooked. He was even abused. But what matters is if God has his hand on you, God uses our circumstances. David is the youngest. David is the neglected one. David is unwanted. David is left out. Yet with all that potential life-warping treatment. And a lot of people, their life stops right there. I'm going to say something real positive, but a lot of people, their life stops right there. And they decide they're going to let all the neglect and abuse and oversight and problems that they have that they can't change, they're going to let that warp them. And the rest of their life, they are going to be a victim of being left. You know, the most repeated experience when they take adults and put them on the couch and try and probe around and find out why their life is warped. You know what the most repeated thing is? That they were left when they were little at the mall or, somewhere and forgotten. And that's ruined their life. And the rest of their life, they feel worthless because someone left them. Well, David wasn't forgotten. He was made to go out there. I mean, it's worse. You want to really get warped? Be rejected. He wasn't just neglected. He was rejected. But he didn't let that warp his life. David just kept following the Lord that he loved. God's choice of the younger over the elder is just another picture of his grace. Have you ever thought about that? Why did Samuel look at Eliab first? Because God, the firstborn. Remember, they got the bigger inheritance, they got the rights, they got and then everything else was split up among the rest. But God doesn't choose the one that everyone else thinks. Remember, Abel was the second-born. Isaac was the second-born. Jacob was the second-born. Joseph was way past second-born. And now David. Look back at verse 11. It Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all the young men here?" And then he said, "There remains yet the youngest. There he is over there. He's keeping the sheep." You see, David was on God's mind. He designed this to be a picture to us. You don't have to be in the prime spot. You don't have to be the oldest or the brightest or the strongest or the most likely to succeed. All you have to have is what God sees, and that's a heart for Him. That's the first thing about God's servants. The second one is God uses the disciplined lives of His servants for His glory. Look at verse 12. David was handsome and hardworking. When Samuel sent for David, they called him from where? Where was David? It says in verse 12, so they sent and brought him in. You know what? Dad hadn't even been paying attention to where David was. Jesse, dad of David. When Samuel came on the spot and says, "Where's your other son?" Jesse said, "Doing what I told him to do. Right over there." How did he know that? Because David was disciplined. David had been given an assignment to watch the sheep. He didn't forget to watch the sheep. He didn't forget it was his turn. He didn't forget it was his day. He didn't forget that was his job. There's something about him that's so simple. David did what he was supposed to do. His dad knew he would be right where he was supposed to be, watching the flocks. By the way, what did David do while he was watching the flock? Keep your finger here and turn back over to Psalm 132. Okay, right in the middle of your Bible. Don't lose your place, but go right to the middle. You should hit somewhere in the Psalms and go to the 132nd Psalm. Because if you remember, Psalm 132 is David's meditation from when he was a shepherd boy. We covered that many weeks ago, and that was the first time I said to you and started thinking about David's spiritual secret. And the 132nd is actually David's spiritual secret. His journal, if you were, his diary, his blog, or whatever you want to call it, where he wrote down. History tells us this is what he wrote when he ascended to be king. When David, as Psalm 78 says, was taken from tending sheep to become the shepherd of the people of God, he seems to have written this 132nd Psalm as his kind of like bio or whatever, and God inspired him to write it. Lord, remember David and all of his afflictions, and David went through a lot, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob. Now here are the resolves of a youngster that became the greatest person most described in the Bible among humans, okay? Here's his resolve. Surely I will not go into the chamber of my house or go up to the comfort of my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord. That's a nice resolve. Have you ever made that one? I might add, I will not park my body and vegetate in front of the television set. I will not invest endless hours watching athletic events. I will not play mindless drivel games of fantasy when I've got the real and living, eternal, infinite God in front of me and ignore Him to do all that. David just had sheep and work. But he says, I will not rest. I will not sleep. I will not close my eyes until I have found a place for the Lord. You know what this is? A holy habit. That's why David was all hung up with making the temple. Because he loved making places for God in his life. That's his first resolve. God's going to have a place in my life. That's what a servant wants. A servant's not concerned about themselves. They're concerned about who they serve. He said, I'm going to make a place for you, God. That's my holy habit. God ahead of comfort. The comfort of my bed. Verse 3. He had this holy habit of making time for God. Verse 6 continues, Behold, we heard of it in Ephrathah. What's that? That's where he lived. That's how we know this is talking about when he was a shepherd boy. Oh, thou Bethlehem Ephrathah. He says, we heard about it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of the woods. Let us go to his tabernacle. Let us worship at his footstool. As a shepherd boy, he longed for God personally. This is almost probably his words from when he used to talk to his brothers and say, I wonder how long before Dad takes us up for the next feast. I can't wait to go to the tent. And the brothers went, what's wrong with you? Man, we want to go see the pretty girls by the well. What do you want to go to some tent and see some God? That's so hokey. You know, things haven't changed. David was different. They thought he was weird. Because his resolve was he wouldn't even sleep at night till he found a place for the Lord. He wouldn't lay down He's out there looking up at the stars and talking to God and praying and all that. He says, I want to worship, verse 7. Let us go into his tabernacle. Let us worship at his footstool. He longed for God. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, to the ark of your strength. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness. Wow. He really thought a lot about purity. And, let your priests be clothed. He was concerned about coming before God and about purity and about being clothed with holiness and righteousness. Let your saints shout for joy. Probably it was pretty dead around the tabernacle in David's time. Nobody engaged in worship, and he wanted to shout for joy. He loved the Lord. He was, verse 10, for your servant David's sake. That's how he looked at himself. Servant of the Lord, David. The Lord has sworn in truth to David, verse 11. He'll not turn away. I'll set upon your throne the fruit of your body. If your sons will keep my covenant and my testimony, which I shall teach them. And on goes the rest of this psalm about his coronation. Well,